coffee and snacks, feel free to do so. Feel free to take seconds throughout the talk. Before we get into Alexander Calder, I want to, first of all, thank Baby Bee Coffee. They are the sponsors for Coffee with the Curator. And I want to promote the next Coffee with the Curator. So it is on Monday, April 8th at 10:30, same place, same time, same day almost. And you're going to hear from our executive director, Tracy Glab. So Tracy is going to talk about the 17th century tapestries in the Viola Bray Renaissance Gallery. So she's going to cover they're described as 3 acts. So Act 1 is Paris to Flint. This will reveal the story of the tapestry's 6,293-mile journey from Paris to Flint. The second act will talk about Sleeping with the Enemy, which explores the stories and the characters of Rinaldo and Armida. And the third part of her talk is called Beyond Warmth and Wealth, examining the symbols in the tapestry. So if you haven't already heard about the tapestries, it is going to be a fantastic talk. So that is Monday, April 8th at 10:30 here in Isabel Hall. Today we're going to talk about Alexander Calder. So let me get my notes straight here. We're going to explore the career of one of the more well-known American artists in American history. So Alexander Calder he was born in 1898. Both of his parents were artists. So from an early age, he was really encouraged to explore and to be creative. His father was a sculptor, his mother was a painter. And so they really wanted him to play around with his imagination. And what he was drawn to as a child was sculpture. When he was 11, actually, he presented his parents with his very first sculptures. So at age 11, for Christmas, he made his mom and dad a dog and a duck. And you can see the duck here. It's made from a sheet of cut brass. And this is before he even really started to think about movement. He was making objects that moved. So this sculpture is kinetic. If you touch the back of its tail, it kind of teeters back and forth. So really early on, he was already exploring these ideas that will become kind of essential in his career. But he decided maybe not to go into the family business. And in before 1923, he decided that, creative life maybe isn't for me in terms of my career. And so what he ended up doing is he moved away and he went to school for engineering. And that, also kind of plays into his later style, as you'll see when we start talking about his mobiles. But in 1923, that creative urge never really left. And he decided to go to New York and to enroll in the Art Students League. And there he started to learn the techniques of artists. He really got into painting. If you look at Alexander Calder's early work, besides something like this, it is very representative of what you see in early 20th century American art. So it's very kind of naturalistic. He focuses a lot on portraits. His style will completely change. But while he was training at the Art Students League, he really embodied that very naturalistic American style painting. So as he's developing in his artistic career, he takes a job with the National Police Gazette. And he was doing illustrations for them, and they decided they wanted to write an article on the circus. So the National Police Gazette sent him to Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus, and they wanted him to create some sketches. He was there for 2 weeks in 1925. While he was there, learning about the circus, drawing figures, really absorbing this whole culture, he became fascinated with the characters of Barnum and Bailey, which, this was a really important kind of aspect of the United States in the early 20th century. So he started to work on these small-scale sculptures, and they embodied the characters of the circus. So you can see here in this sculpture called Clown, where he's taking kind of everyday objects and turning them into characters of the circus. The photograph that you see on the right is the very beginnings of that. So it's actually, it looks like he's making, in the process of making the trapeze artist, or the trapeze. There's a little horse down at the bottom. And some of these are movable, so that horse, there's a little crank, and you can make the horse, his legs move up and down. So he's already making kinetic sculptures, these objects that have the ability to move. So this becomes kind of a fascination with him. He creates an entire circus, and he ends up taking it over to Paris. So he moves to Paris in 1926, and he's working heavily on this large assemblage of all of these figures. You've got acrobats, horses, clowns, pretty much anything you can imagine that would be found in a circus. And people started to to kind of hear about this around Paris, and they wanted to see the show. And what he would do is he could pack everything into two suitcases. And so he would kind of fold up all the sculptures and pack them away, and then he would travel around and he'd set up his circus, and he would perform. I was going to show a video, but they're a little long online, but if you're interested in learning about Calder's early years in his circus series, highly recommend going home and Googling it. You can watch him set the whole thing up, and you can watch all of these little figures move. They dance around the circle. It's really, really fascinating. And this is actually quite large. Here's a sense of scale. So in the previous image, there's a print, and that's a flyer. So this became kind of an event in Paris. You could go and you could watch Calder animate his circus. So again, we're kind of seeing him already thinking about movement and motion. It's not in the way that will, his major style, which is abstraction, but early on in his career, he's always thinking about motion and movement. So he spent quite a bit of time creating these artworks. He was also painting, making jewelry, and making other sculptures while he was working in Paris. This photograph is, that's Calder standing next to the circus. This is at the Whitney in New York City. It has its own little room, so if you're ever there, make sure to go in and see all of the fantastic little features. Because he used a lot of found objects or atypical material, it started to deteriorate, and they raised funds to have it conserved. So it's in a very dimly lit room to preserve especially the cloth elements of the sculpture. So anyway, he starts kind of learning about art in Paris. He starts meeting a lot of artists who are also working in Paris. Whether or not they're French, there's the 1920s in Paris is really an epicenter for artistic creativity. But what he ends up doing is he becomes friends with some really key, significant artists. And he moves on from making these little kinetic wires, typically wire sculptures, and he makes larger scale wire sculptures that tend to be portraits of friends. So this photograph is Ferdinand Léger, which he is a French surrealist. And so you see him alongside his wire portrait. And honestly, for a sculpture made of wire, it's pretty, the likeness is definitely there. So this technique is something that he learned a little earlier on. So while he was working for the National Police Gazette, he would make line drawings. And he challenged himself to make line drawings with a continuous line. And so to think about how you would create a figure or whatever you're doing without picking your pencil off of the paper. So he decided to try that in 3 dimension. So these portraits are an exercise in that. So the technique that this line drawing technique that he used when he was working for the newspaper, he picked up when he was studying at the Art Students League. So he extended this technique into 3 dimensions, and basically he turned these line drawings into 3-dimensional sculpture. So there's a heavy emphasis on the ridges, the lines, because there is no option to do any sort of shading. So he's taking a technique, a 2-dimensional technique, and starting to really make it 3-dimensional. These were not typically kinetic, so they didn't usually move. Every once in a while, they have moving parts. But this is his next kind of major series, is portraits made of wire. Things start to change drastically, though, as we reach the 1930s. So, as I said, he moved to Paris in 1926, and he's creating a circus, creating these portraits, meeting a bunch of artists, and he is absorbing what is going on in the art scene in the 1920s. So the first 2 decades of the 20th century, American art was still very naturalistic and very representational. I know many of you saw American Realism, the exhibition that closed in the end of winter, or the end of the year. So think of that style that you saw in that exhibition. That's really what was going on, very popular in the US when Calder was coming of age as an artist. That's not really necessarily what was going on in Europe. Now, there were still plenty of European artists who were painting in a naturalistic or representational manner. But what we end up seeing in the first 2 decades of the 20th century in Europe, Paris in particular, is this incredible shift in the style of art. Probably one of the biggest shifts in the history of art, which is going from recognizable imagery to going to pure abstraction. And so this is a really wild and important time in Europe. And for Calder to be there while these ideas are being formulated and implemented is quite impressive. So just to give a little backstory on kind of the developments of modernism. So he would have had a little bit less exposure to modern art like this when he was living in the US. It wasn't unheard of. People like Alfred Stieglitz were championing European modernism in the US. We have the Armory Show in 1913, which really brings modern art from across the world to the United States. But it's still a very small section of what we see going on in the United States. But in Europe, we really start to see abstraction kind of take hold in 1905, 1907-ish is when we really start to see. So when Picasso and Braque met in 1905, there were artists before these 2 artists connected that were already kind of breaking down recognizable forms, making them a little bit more abstract. But these 2 men got together and started talking about form and space. And they developed Cubism. So in 1907 is when we start to see the 2 artists really showing the fracturing of space or creating geometric objects to indicate potentially a form. But it is really the moment when we are starting to see abstraction take off. So that's 1905, 1907-ish is when they really started painting. So 1905, I mean, Calder is still he's a young kid basically at this time. So over the next couple decades, we see what we are looking at on the screen here. We see a major shift. And Calder ends up meeting some of these artists. He's absorbing a lot of what is going on in Paris. Many artists that are not from France are moving to Paris from various Germany, various different countries, because this is the center of the art world. So these are some examples of the modernism that Calder would have experienced when he was living in France. So we have Marcel Duchamp on the left. This is Nude Descending a Staircase. This is one of those iconic paintings in the history of art. And this was actually exhibited at the Armory Show in New York, and critics went wild. There are some fantastic cartoons about how people would look at this and say, well, there's no body. How is this a nude? Where is the nude? So he's taking kind of a page from what Picasso and Braque did in the early phases of Cubism and fracturing the form. So you can't even really tell the difference between the background and the object, because every inch of the painting is broken into these geometric planes. We have Juan Miro, who is the top kind of center image. Miro was exploring surrealism. The other really fascinating thing about working in Paris in the 1920s-ish is that you didn't have just one dominant art style. There were a bunch of different art styles happening at the same time. So there are people still working in the Cubist style. There are people like Miro who are exploring the subconscious mind and playing around with these fantastical shapes and creatures and figures. Think Salvador Dali as well. There are artists like Pierre Mondrian who are really sticking to very rigid forms of geometry. So Mondrian's painting is in the bottom center. Mondrian plays a really big role in Calder's career. We'll learn about that in just a second. And then Hans Arp is on the far right. Hans Arp was a Dada artist. So you've got De Stijl, Cubism, Surrealism, and Dada, and other forms of art all taking place at the same time. The Arp painting, or the Arp artwork, is a painting basically made with the laws of chance. So he ripped up a bunch of paper and he threw it up in the air, and where it landed is where supposedly he glued the pieces down. I don't know if I believe it. Not anything crosses over, no overlap, but it was that idea of chance. So we're exploring European artists and some American artists, but European artists are exploring things that are really unseen, the unconscious mind, chance, really in-depth color. And so this is the environment that Calder is living in when he's in Paris. And he starts to make friends with people like Pierre Mondrian. So in 1930, he visited his studio. And this is an image of Mondrian's studio. And he was really impressed with this wall of colored cardboard rectangles. So it doesn't translate as well in black and white. It's beyond the two paintings you see, there are a series of rectangles on the wall. Those were, you could move them around, and Mondrian would kind of move the rectangles on his wall to get ideas for compositions. Calder walks in and thinks, oh, there's some potential here. So this is what he says about his visit with Mondrian. He said, it was a very exciting room. Light came in from the left and the right, and on the solid wall between the windows were experimental stunts with colored rectangles of cardboard tacked on. I suggested to Mondrian that perhaps it would be fun to make these rectangles oscillate. And he, with a very serious countenance, said, no, it is not necessary. My paintings are already very fast. This one visit gave me a shock that started things. So this moment of him looking at these rectangles and saying, oh, what if they moved? He has a history of making sculpture that moves. Now you see these flat forms, these flat shapes of color. He's embracing already the abstraction that we see in modern art, and he's thinking about how that can be connected to movement. So 1930 is really the kind of changing point in his career. He was really interested in the abstract art that he saw around him, but it was this idea of taking the flat forms, the flat shapes, and making them move that kind of stuck with him for pretty much the rest of his career. So in 1931, we see Calder create something that we know, when you think of Alexander Calder, this type of art is probably one of the two things that comes to your mind right away. So in the fall of 1931, he created his first kinetic sculpture in abstract form. This is not the first one, but this is an early, very, very early kinetic sculpture. So the first two that he made were actually connected to motors, which is not surprising because some of his circus figures were connected to motors. And so he thought, well, if I'm going to make it move, let's put a motor on it so it will move on its own. And he started to think, do I need that? Can I make something where it doesn't need the motor? And remember his experience with the metal circus figures and the wire portraits, manipulating that metal in such a way where you can have pieces that kind of move and twist and turn in space is the next kind of phase. So in 31, we have these kinetic sculptures connected to motors. Later on in that year, you have something like you see here with object of red disc. So there's no motor connected to this. It is just wind or human touch, especially if you were to kind of flick that black ball down at the bottom, the whole thing would start to move. So what do we call these? I mean, they're sculpture, but they're not sculpture in the sense that we're familiar with it. If you think, if I were to have you describe what sculpture was, maybe you would say an object made of metal or something carved of marble. I don't know as though the description for many people would say something about how it actually moves. So his artwork kind of lingers somewhere between this traditional form of art that's sculpture and something different. And so there was a name created, and it was created by Marcel Duchamp, here on the left. Marcel Duchamp gets the credit for creating the title mobiles, or mobiles. So he was basically talking to Calder and talking about the movement. So mobile or mobile in French refers to motion and motive. And the artworks that you see here, so the one on the right is more of a traditional mobile or mobile. So what happens then when you have a sculpture that doesn't move? The one on the left does move, but it is in the form of his next type of sculpture, which also needed a name. So if we're going to call his kinetic sculptures mobiles, then what do we call the ones that are not kinetic? Are those just sculptures? I imagine that there was some discussion between him and his friends at this time, because another artist, Hans Art, who, painting on the left, or artwork on the left, came up with the name stabile, or stables. So you got a mobile that moves, and you got a stable that doesn't move. So technically this image on the left moves, but it is indicative of what we'll see actually in the next slide of when his artwork stops actually moving. So Calder himself distinguishes between his mobiles and his stabiles, mobile stables. And he says, the mobile has actually movement in itself, while the stabile is back to the old painting idea of implied movement. You have to walk around the stabile or through it, and the mobile dances in front of you. Mobile, stabile, pronounced in different ways, but the idea is that one of them, to create movement, you have to move. The other one moves for you. So there is movement in both of these. It's just a different type of movement. So by around, let me go back to this. By around 1935, he's growing the scale of these sculptures. They're still very, very delicate, which is kind of, but they give an indicator of what his artwork is gonna look like over time. So the image on the left is much, much larger than any of the mobiles that he has created before. These are kind of like tabletop sculptures. This is much larger, and he made a bunch of them for his garden. But they were so delicate, and the wires were so thin that if you had a windy day, they would tip over. So he started to think about, how can I change this? I want both of these worlds. I want the kinetic world, and I want the traditional sculptural world. So what we end up seeing is the birth of a kind of solid metal form. So his stables start to look like this. So Devilfish is his first large-scale stable. It was made in 1937. And the curves are kind of intended to create a sense of swirling motion, kind of like what you would see in the ocean, whether it's in waves or whether it's fish kind of moving through the water. So Devilfish, you kind of get, sometimes his titles help you think about what these forms might be, but in reality, they're abstract forms. So there is no recognizable fin or tail of a fish, but the title kind of makes us start to think of those things. So his career is taking off. So really, at the end of the 1930s into the early 1940s, we are really starting to see a lot of commissions, and we're starting to hear about Calder in the larger art world. So he was commissioned in, right before World War II. He made a large mobile for the World's Fair in Paris, and he was commissioned to make 2 for the Museum of Modern Art. So this is the one that the Museum of Modern Art commissioned. So art institutions throughout the world are starting to take notice. It is something, especially a mobile. These are things that we have not seen in the art world before. You could see abstract sculpture. You could see abstract painting. What you're not seeing is abstract sculpture that moves. And these basically just move with air currents. So lobster trap and fishtail is one of those kind of iconic mobiles from Alexander Calder. So the lobster trap is that little wire cage over on the side, the right side, and then the fishtail is above. And then you have these abstract forms. They're very reminiscent of what we have in our lobby. So you'll kind of see that continuing on. During World War II, there was shortages of materials, and particularly metal was a very important material. Calder had moved back to the United States at this point in time, so he's living in the US, and we're conserving resources. So it wasn't as easy for him to go out and just buy sheet metal to make these 7 and 8 foot long sculptures. So what he did during World War II is his scale tends to get smaller, and he uses different materials. So something that was much easier to find was wood. So in Vertical Constellation with Yellow Bone, you see the figure and the forms are made of wood as opposed to metal. When he did use metal during the war, he repurposed it from other sculptures. So there's a handful, or at least a decent amount of metal sculptures that he created during World War II, but that was all repurposed. Wood is what you'll end up kind of looking at. His career is kind of fascinating if you look from the beginning to the end on how things kind of shift and change, but once he hits that idea of abstraction, he kind of sticks with it. So post-war, when resources are much more available, just to caveat, just to go back for 1 second, he intended to go fight in World War II, and I don't know exactly why, but he signed up and he was denied. So while people were fighting overseas, he was making sculpture back home. So in 1949, he started to work on his largest mobile to date. And this is called the International Mobile, and it's at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, or it was made for their 3rd international exhibition of sculpture. So this is a kind of interesting series of photographs because you can see how the artist works. We have a page from his sketchbook. He's got the name and where it's going, or the name and his name. And then you are starting to notice where these forms and these shapes will be. He gives it about a rough estimate on size, 20 feet. It's a little bit smaller than that, it's about 16 by 16, but it's still quite massive for the time. Then we have him mid-installation, so kind of holding up these series of wires and metal panels, and then you have it hung in the space. So to date, this was his largest sculpture. Throughout the 1950s, he continues to create artwork that is both modern and abstract and kinetic. So pieces like this, Red Stock is again a mobile that will sit on a table or sit on the ground, and the wires kind of move with the currents of air. One of his more famous artworks, this is Big Red, which I think looks really, really similar to our Alexander Calder sculpture, hangs from the ceiling. So some of them sit on the floor and they have an armature that helps them, have those moving elements, and some of them dangle from the ceiling. So he's continuing to make these sculptures for both private commissions and for public institutions. And as his career grows and grows, he's asked for more and more and bigger and bigger. So I want a bigger floating sculpture, I want a bigger mobile. Or how about you make a stable for our plaza, or something where you need a large space. So as the scale of these got bigger, the amount that he made got less. And with each one of these artworks, and in between and not related to the artworks that he makes in metal, he is creating drawings and paintings that are all in this same kind of abstract style. So he began to concentrate his efforts on these really large scale commissions. And especially in his later years, here's another photograph of Red Fishtail. This is actually a good moment to kind of talk about how these work. You can see that you have just large wire arms or armatures, and on the ends of them you have an eyelet, and then connected to them another eyelet. And so that's really where the movement is created. I don't have my pointer, but you can see them really kind of clearly up at the top of this sculpture. So that allows things to move around. But he's working on a series of large-scale stables. And one of them is not too far away. So if you haven't seen it, you can take a day trip and go see one of his large sculptures. This was made in 1969. And it is called La Grande Vitesse, and it's in Grand Rapids. And it basically means Grand Rapids, as that's what it translates to. Because he spent so much time in Paris, a lot of his sculptures have French names. So this is a perfect example of one of his large-scale stables. Now, when I kind of gave you the quote of how he distinguished the two, this is a really fun example because he mentioned that with a stable, you need to do the movement, you need to walk around. And something like this, on this side, and on this scale, you actually can walk in and around and through it, so you can fit underneath. And so as you are moving through the space, it is changing your atmosphere and it is changing your space. So while it does not oscillate like redfish tail or, this is ours, I don't know why I said this, yeah, anyway, sorry, this is ours, redfish tail in our lobby. It really is moving regardless. So you'll find in large cities, a lot of them have these piazzas, and especially the taller you build buildings, the more kind of plaza space you need. In some cities, New York specifically, Chicago as well, if you don't do that and you just put giant tall buildings everywhere, the sunlight does not really make its way down to the road. So you have a very dark city. And so a lot of cities have these big open plazas. And if you don't fill them with something, they're just kind of open. So people don't really know how to function within them. They tend to just walk through them. And they don't explore and experience that open space. So places like Chicago would commission an artist like Alexander Calder to fill that space with something. And so these are really fantastic types of art to be placed in these public spaces. And they really kind of meld with the space around them. I mean, you can see here, look at the buildings behind. The Grand Rapids Calder actually does have some green space around it. This one in Chicago does not. It's buildings surrounding all different sides. The buildings are really fantastic too because they're designed by Mies van der Rohe. So Mies van der Rohe, a hugely significant artist in the modernist tradition. But you have this big open plaza, and the bright red of this sculpture kind of draws people in. You have these beautiful arch shapes that kind of contradict the rigid, angular lines of a building. So you have this juxtaposing image, this movement, this rounded, bright red sculpture next to these metal buildings with straight horizontal lines. But they're made of essentially the same material. We have a metal sculpture next to these metal-clad buildings. And so they really tend to kind of activate these urban spaces in a way that it plays along with the architecture. So he was thinking about all of this when he was designing these. So he really continued to create these large-scale stables and larger-scale mobiles for the rest of his career. He passed away in 1976, but his impact on the world of art is, felt to this day. So his style is what we've kind of seen already. He uses these basic geometric forms, such as circles and squares and ovals, to show his commitment to the form itself. They are typically painted in either a bright primary color or black and white. So he actually uses pretty much the same color palette that we see Mondrian using in his paintings. Redfish tail it's in our lobby. I'm sure you've all seen it, but if not, it is in the lobby, so as soon as you exit, look to your right and you will see it. Redfish tail's got an interesting story here in Flint. It was part of the first Flint Invitational exhibition. So it showed up here in 1966. This exhibition is really fascinating. So it's the Flint Invitational. And basically what it was doing was celebrating one of the expansions of the museum. So they brought in a series of artists, really contemporary artists, to do an exhibition. So invitations were written, they were sent out to either artists or their dealers, representatives, and they said, we would really like to have an artwork by Alexander Calder in the Flint Invitational. So again, this is 1966. There were incredible artists represented in this show. Many of them are still in our permanent collection. Calder, of course, Gottlieb, Grace Hartigan. So you can actually see the Gottlieb is on view, which was purchased as part of the Flint Invitational. So part of the process of this exhibition was that there was a purchase prize. So the FIA had, at the time, was $25,000. They had $25,000 to spend on purchasing artwork from the Invitational to be part of the museum's permanent collection. Just to give you a little, I did the math, I was curious. In 1966, $25,000 is today's equivalent of $250,000, which is a nice chunk if you're looking to buy some new art. And so this was on exhibit with these other really well-known modern artists. Many of them Calder worked with and knew. And they become, some of they're the most famous artists of this time. And to think that we had a bunch of them here in Flint is really kind of exciting for an art history nerd like myself. But he didn't just do sculptures. I kind of mentioned that he worked on painting. He also created a lot of jewelry, and we have a number of his works on paper in our collection. So we have a series of prints. There are, the four I'm going to show you, we have these on view in our graphics gallery. So if you walk down to look at the Atelier 17 show, in the graphics gallery, you'll see the hallway has these Alexander Calder prints on view. So he's not only known for the mobiles and the stables, but his two-dimensional art is quite stunning as well. And it relies on the same type of things, geometric shapes. Sometimes they're kind of biomorphic, and focuses on primary colors. So I just want to show you a couple of them on the big screen before you see them in person. Balloons is pretty interesting. This is a little bit of a different one from the other two that I'm going to show you. This is kind of showing, again, his interest in geometric shapes, but there are these drippy elements that you see in balloons. The blue kind of drips from one circle into the other, the black bleeds into the lower two red circles, and that yellow one has drips of everything. So this was in 1973. This is kind of post-abstract expressionist style where you see a lot of drips and splatters. But I think one of the things that's really fantastic about this movement, you can almost feel the ink moving throughout the surface. So here's another example of where he's exploring abstraction, but giving us movement. This here, of course, is movement in 2 dimensions, so it's not actually moving. You can't move throughout the space like you could a stable, but it's his idea of kind of playing around with motion. And then, of course, we have kind of back to his roots with geometric shapes. And then lastly, I wanted to just show you this. His very early stables, he has, I just pulled one of them, but there are a series of wood panels with a metal armature and metal figures, metal forms, kind of dangling in front of the background. So it's a painting in motion, really. And I thought it was pretty interesting to look at how, this is from 1936 on the right, this is from 1975 on the left. Those shapes are still, that basic concept is still there. So Calder is an interesting artist because he worked in a number of different art forms or art mediums, but once he got his kind of mature style in the 1930s, he kind of sticks with it throughout the remainder of his career, focusing on abstraction, focusing on bright colors, geometric or kind of biomorphic forms, but he's consistent throughout the remainder of his career. So I highly encourage you to go and look at Redfish Tail. It may or may not be moving depending on the air currents, and then head down to the graphics gallery and look at the works on paper. So are there any questions? Yes?
So You mentioned bright colors a moment ago.
Yes.
In downtown Detroit, there's a young woman in her scooters, and it's all in black. And I think it changed colors. Should that really be red?
So that's a great question. I have seen a number of his stables that are black. So they're not always red. I don't know if it was ever intended to be red and painted, but I have seen some of the stables that are black. I don't think I've seen any white ones, but black. They're typically red, but yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
It was interesting to see the drawing of his plan for a mobile. I'm curious, when he went to execute that, there must have been a lot of trial and error, because if it was going to hang the way he wanted it to hang, he would have to change maybe the joints or the size and weight of the metal parts or the wooden parts. Did that require a lot of
I think so.
interaction with him?
I think especially in the early days, yes, there was probably a lot of trial and error. And I think he would have had to, especially if it was hung, he'd probably have to hang it and then really kind of explore how things would connect. As he got further on in his career, I think probably some of it became more intuitive, and he would know that if this wire is this long, I know it's going to tip 45 degrees or whatever. But I think so. I think a lot of it, and maybe that's why it's so sketchy and not completely planned. The other thing, as he grew in popularity, he did utilize other fabricators. So we have some interesting photos in our records of fabrication where Calder is working with another artist on, it looked like he was working on the shapes and creating the shapes. Because he was an elderly man, of course, he worked up until his death. And so he started to use a lot of that. Plus he had a lot of output, so he was making a lot. So I do think that there was a lot of trial and error, and I think as he got more advanced with his technique, he did kind of know. Any other questions? Yeah.
So you said that any of like the metal sculptures he did in World War II were reclaimed from, so does that mean like he disassembled previous sculptures and then created new ones?
Yes.
So interesting to think about what doesn't exist anymore because of that.
And I think he also, if he could find like scrap metal some places or like his house, but yeah, it sounded as though, in the research I did at least, it sounded as though he took things apart. And it could have been things like, maybe that this thing didn't work, his trial and error, so maybe he reused those parts. When I was doing the research for this talk, I looked at the war years. There's a website that you can see almost all of his works of art. And the wooden ones were much more predominant. And the metal ones are definitely different. And you can see that they may be reclaimed. So, yeah.
It seems like most of his mobiles are public spaces. They're quite large in scale. Did he do them for smaller spaces?
Yes, he did some for smaller spaces. You could even see like things that you would put on your table. He also did a lot of private commissions. So there are probably a lot of them that are still in private collections.
Are there any other artists, either of his time or any other time, that specialize in these mobiles? And if so, what materials did they use?
I cannot think of any off the top of my head. Trying to think of artists. I can't think of any that were even around his time. That I think is one of the things that is so fascinating about Alexander Calder is it was so unique. I'm not saying that there were not artists doing it, but I can't, off the top of my head, I can't think of anybody. But there probably were people exploring, especially after they started to see. Contemporary artists are playing around with kinetic artwork. Some of them use metal, some of them use different type of materials, cloth. Yeah. But if anybody knows of anybody else, let me know, because it's a new artist starting to look up. Any other questions? Well, thank you all for attending. Hopefully you have some movement today, meandering through the galleries. and thinking about how sculptures activate our space if we're walking through them or if they're moving around us. So thank you so much. Don't forget to come back on April 8th for Tracy's talk about the gray tapestries.